Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bob Unger Show. I am very honored to have as our guest an extremely erudite man, Art Thompson. Art is the CEO of the John Birch Society, and he's written several books. And not to be trite, but his books are a work of art. I couldn't resist. So Art, give the listeners a little bit of your background and how you came to where you are today. You don't have to go back to when you were on breast milk, but you could, or regular milk, but you can give us the essentials.
Well, first of all, let me state that just in the last week, I have stepped down as CEO of the John Birch Society.
Oh, okay.
I have done that to prepare the way for younger leadership. I am now 82 years old. My head still works okay, but my body doesn't always do what I want it to do.
Well, you don't have to be 82 for that. It can happen before.
Well, that's true. That's true. But I've been very lucky in that regard. At any rate, what happened to me was that I grew up in the city of Seattle. And something that happened very early on in my life was that my father got in trouble with the union in his town. He was a member of the union. And he was straight back from Guadalcanal and places like that during World War II as a Marine. So he was kind of a macho fellow. And one of the union meetings, the president got up and says, I nominate myself for re-election. All in favor say yes. And they didn't take a no vote. And so that irritated him. So they got into a verbal, altercation. And finally, my dad went up and socked this union leader. Well, you're not supposed to do that.
That's disappointing.
Yes. So anyway, the goon squad followed him home that night, and he was lucky to get away from them. And we slept on the floor for over a year because the union people were outside the house with spotlights and rifles and that sort of thing. Now, they never fired into the house, but that was the sort of thing we were living under for about a year. In this process, the communists within the union tried to recruit him into the Communist Party. And he was a patriot. He wasn't going to listen to any of it. But we used to get subscriptions to the Worker and the People's World and things like that in the mail given to us free. So my mother would give them to me and say, take these out to the burn barrel. Don't read them. Just burn them. Well, I read them. But I was an anti-communist. My dad had gotten me to read 1984 when I was 11 years old, for instance.
By George Orwell.
Yeah, and he got me to read all the lives of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He got me to read the Declaration and the Constitution long before it came up in school to get me to understand these things. So at any rate, in this process, I began to understand that there was a problem with communists. And I went along for a while, and I'd walk down the streets of Seattle and see these communist posters and so on and so forth, people out hawking the Worker on the street corner and that sort of thing. And that's the atmosphere I grew up in, but I was an anti-communist. Well, I got into the service, came home, and then I started to see this tremendous furor in the newspapers about the John Birch Society. And based on what I was doing, I started to infiltrate Marxist organizations in tandem with the Seattle Police Intelligence Squad. And based on what I knew, what the John Birch Society was saying was correct. And I said, well, why are they being chastised in the newspapers for telling the truth? Well, anyway, I went along, I didn't join. I looked for the John Birch Society. I knew they were a secret organization because I couldn't find them.
That's pretty secret.
Yeah, exactly. So one day a guy knocked on my door and wanted me to sign a petition to draft Barry Goldwater for president. And we became friends, and he gave me a book called The Politician. And he wanted me to read it. So a couple of weeks later, or maybe maybe a couple of days later, he came back, and it just so happened I was reading it as he knocked on the door. So I had my finger in the text and the other finger in the index in the notes, because it was very heavily. It had a lot of notes that you had to look back and forth. He says, "What do you think of the book?" And I told him, and I says, finally, I says, "Are you a member of the John Birch Society?" And he says, "What do you want to know for?" I says, "'Cause I want to." Yeah. So I want to join. Well, when he'd come to my house, I would talk like a conservative patriot, but my coffee table was full of communist literature. So he didn't know where I was coming from, okay? And so they wouldn't let me join for a few months until they got to know me better and realized that I was for real. And I got involved with a chapter, became section leader, became the head of ad hoc committees and all of that business. Finally, I was asked on the staff of the John Birch Society. Meanwhile, I'd got my military obligation out of the way. I went to the university for a while, then switched over to private schools for my profession and that sort of thing. But became a coordinator, and then after about 11 or 12 years, I quit and formed my own businesses. I had 2 or 3 businesses that I had formed, manufacturing things. And then back in 1995, I decided to get rid of all my business obligations and come back on the society staff, because I could just see things were a real problem. I had to get back full time. So that's what I did. Then worked myself up through the ranks and became CEO of the society in 2005, and was in that position until just this week.
I see. And when you joined the society, were you aware that it wasn't quite as simple as just the communists on one side and the so-called conservatives on the other? Or had you gone deeper down the rabbit hole back in those days?
No, I did not. I had no clue. It was Robert Welch and what he brought forward that I suddenly realized, it was like my eyes being opened. The thing is that I could already see conspiracy, but conspiracy from the standpoint of the communists in my community, because I knew people that were communists because of my infiltration, but they presented themselves as something entirely different to the public. They were in our legislature. For instance, at one time, the Washington State Legislature had more percentage-wise Communist Party members elected to office as state representatives and state senators than any other state in the Union. In fact, where the slogan came from, the Soviet of Washington, was penned by James Farley, who was Postmaster General under President Roosevelt. Well, you use that now, the Soviet of Massachusetts or whatever, but that's originally was in Washington. So I knew that there was an awful lot of infiltration. I knew there was a conspiracy. The first time I ever went to a closed communist meeting, not an official party meeting, but only where communists were invited, was for a minister. And it was to celebrate his 80th birthday. His son, a lawyer, was a communist. His bishop was a communist. His archbishop was a communist, and they were all there. So I could see the conspiratorial aspect of this behind the scenes, of presenting one thing to the public and the other thing, what they really were, they kept secret. So I was set to understand a conspiracy on a wider level, particularly when I realized that a conspiracy does not work unless it works both sides. In other words, it wasn't just simply conservatives versus communists, it was communists and some conservatives. So my eyes really got opened when I got very involved in politics. I ran for state representative and that sort of thing, which I left out of my biography. But in the process of doing that, I became very active within the Republican Party. And I started to see there things that really didn't add up to me. If you are conservatives, if you believe in the Constitution, if you're anti-communist, why are you doing this instead of that? And it really opened my eyes that there was something very wrong. I remember having a meeting with John Tower, United States Senator from Texas, and that was involved in the Goldwater campaign. And I found myself being alone with him in the room after all the meeting was over and talking to him back and forth. And I realized this man really doesn't know anything. It's incredible how really uneducated as to the problem was. And here he is, the United States Senator. So it opened up my mind that maybe I shouldn't have a whole bunch of Republican heroes and follow them if they don't understand those things. And that sort of thing became a real problem for me. And so when Mr. Wells started to talk about the Illuminati and things of that nature, I was ready for it because it made sense. It just finally made sense. And so I've done a lot of study on the Illuminati, and I've written a history book of the first 100 years of the United States based on their infiltration into the United States, starting at approximately 1785, at least by that time, and the effect they had on American politics from that time forward. We came very close to losing the United States within 10 years of its existence. And it was all done by people infiltrating from Germany and France, but primarily France, into the United States. They infiltrated the Washington administration. They had people sitting in the cabinet of George Washington giving information out to the other side. And these were all
In fact, Washington wrote a letter talking about the Illuminati and
that's correct.
Infiltration into the Masonic lodges. So this
that's correct.
You know, that's the thing that always attracted me in the beginning to the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society doesn't say, believe it because we tell you. They say, believe it because the people that we're accusing of being conspirators, they themselves tell you what they're going to do and what they're doing. It's all there, but unfortunately, most Americans, thanks to the government schools, don't read very well or are just too mentally lazy to read.
Well, the thing is that you've got Frederick Engels, you've got Woodrow Wilson, you've got Benjamin Disraeli, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain, you've got Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain. All of these people talked about the conspiracy. They were very open about it. But nobody knows where to resource a lot of those talks and books and speeches where they were talking about it. And it was a real serious problem. In fact, John Jay, the first Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice, actually headed up a committee in New York State to investigate and detect conspiracies. That was the name of the committee, the New York Committee to investigate, or not investigate, to detect conspiracies. They were very concerned about it when we started our country.
Well, let's get into the book a little bit. The book is in the shadows of the deep state, and people have heard this term, the deep state, the deep state. You hear it all the time. But most people, when they hear the term the deep state, they think of these intermediate level bureaucrats that are always sticking their noses where they don't belong into your business, and they're more of a nuisance than anything else. Or they might say, oh yeah, those are the guys that wanted to impeach Donald Trump. But they don't get into what the deep state really is at its foundation. So let's talk about that a little bit, if you will.
Sure. Yeah, in fact, every book I've ever seen with the deep state on the title or subtitle never talks about it. They talk about, oh, well, this has got to do with Hillary, this has got to do with Biden, this has got to do with Obama. They never really get into how did Obama and Biden get elected to begin with? How did Hillary stay in the fight to begin with? They had to have organization behind them, and they had to have people guiding them. One of the things that conspirators don't like to do is to get out front in front of the public. They like to stay behind the scenes. And so, because it's more safe there. If things fall apart, who do they shoot first? The guy that's out front. So they stay behind. There's a little story, by the way, that an individual told about the communist revolution in Algeria, for instance, that they would have the demonstrators march on the local police stations in Algeria. And so the French would say, okay, start shooting these demonstrators before they get here, because they're going to burn down the police station with us in it. So they would start shooting people in front. Well, the leaders of these organizations realized, hey, wait a minute, we can't stay in front anymore. We'll only get so far. And when we get that far, we'll step into the doorways so that we get hidden from these bullets, protected from them. And so then the French authorities say, now watch who steps in the doorways before and start shooting those people first.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like the famous line from the movie The Wizard of Oz, when the wizard is detected, when the dog Toto pulls back the curtain,
Yeah.
the wizard is screaming, pay no attention to behind the curtain.
Yeah.
And the average person pays no attention to the men behind the curtain. So let's talk about who are these people, who are these organizations that are in the deep recesses of the deep state? What is their agenda? And what are their various covers, their disguises in life?
Well, first of all, let's talk about their agenda, because while they have, like the 10 steps, for instance, in the Communist Manifesto for communizing a country, that's one thing. But the overall agenda is only exposed on one step in the Communist Manifesto, for instance, and that is to unite the world into a one world government of united communist parties, in that particular wing of the conspiracy. That's the one thing they've been open about forever. The other thing that they are less open about, but you could see it in their practice, is the elimination of God from public life. In other words, God is not to be mentioned at all. It's only the state. We worship Big Brother. God doesn't give you bread. Big Brother gives you bread, whatever. So the two main things in their agenda is one, a one world government ruled by them, and the other is to eliminate God. Have nothing above the state that's more important than the state. That's their primary bedrock agenda. Everything else is piled up on top of that. Now, they are basically satanic in that regard. Now, everyone, I don't care if you talk to Bill Jasper, Alex Newman, etc., individuals such as ourselves who've actually gotten down at where the rubber hits the road and gets to know these communist leaders and others, not just simply the communists. They are involved with strange practices. They are satanic in every shape and form. That's hard to believe for most people because they can't see it. That is something they kind of hide. But their symbolism is there. Once you know what their symbols are and that sort of thing, you start to see it happening. Anyway, I'm getting off track. These people primarily are behind the scenes. They're not, as I said, out front. They organize organizations. They find people to subsidize those organizations, like the Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, Ford Foundation, and that sort of thing, to where they can operate. They take their minions from the colleges, from the secret society fraternities, for instance, like Skull and Bones at Yale, that kind of thing. And they start to bring these people up. And they use them as long as they are usable, so to speak. If they start to deviate, you never hear from them again. You don't have any idea. You can look at a long list of Skull and Bones, for instance, that secret society. And until quite recently, most of those people disappeared from history because they didn't stay in the system, so to speak. They didn't do what they wanted, what the hierarchy wanted them to do. The people that actually start organizations like that do sometimes get out front. For instance, the two people that started Skull and Bones, William Russell and all of a sudden his name escapes me, Alphonso Taft, they did get out front. Alphonso Taft finally became Secretary of State. William Russell became very big in the legislature in his state, so on and so forth. But usually that is not necessarily the case. At any rate, they start organizations that promote a one world government. That is always the main ingredient in most of the organizations that they promote, such as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Brookings Institute, Aspen, things of that nature. Then they start to enlist people into this idealistic idea. I mean, after all, aren't we all for universal peace? Well, what's the solution? Well, it's a one world government. Oh, yeah, okay. So there are a lot of people that will go through life never understanding that, wait a minute, that's a very dangerous thing. For instance, the Baron, the English Baron, Lord Acton, penned a very interesting adage. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. No exceptions ever in the history of man. That's why we have a constitution that limits power to try and prevent our own government from assuming power beyond what's right. At any rate, if you understand that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, you would never be for a world government, because all it would do is become corrupt sooner or later with nothing to curtail that corruption. There isn't anything else. It's just that one government.
Well, if local government is a big pain in the neck.
Oh, sure, that too.
Could you imagine what world government would be with ultimate power?
Absolutely. And so a lot of times these solutions, people don't think through. It's one of the problems we have with our people. And it's not just our people, it's with Germans or Poles or Chinese or anybody else. They don't think of the ramifications of what they advocate, of what they've been programmed to advocate. What's down at the end of the road? What could happen? Even though history has told them over and over again what can happen. We have quotes from all sorts of people, from Cicero on forward, saying that, hey, Isaiah, if you don't have knowledge, particularly of your history, you're doomed. You've got to understand your history. You've got to understand where you come from as a country and as a system of government, or you will be conned into totalitarianism. It's just that simple.
The prophet Hosea said that my people die for lack of knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, at any rate, who are actually the men behind the whole scheme? Don't really know. When people ask me that question, I say, I believe it is an obscure professor at some little rinky-dink college, because he's so far away from things that no one would ever believe that he's the leader. And if you look at it, that's exactly how the Illuminati started. It was started by an obscure professor at a university in Bavaria, Germany. And nobody knew who he was for years. It was one of the best kept secrets of the Illuminati. And
you're talking about Adam Weishaupt?
Yes, that's correct. When Adam Weishaupt was outed, the Illuminati had a real tough time, because people said, why should I follow that guy? You know, he's the leader of the Illuminati. You got to be kidding. And so a lot of them quit the Illuminati as a result of it. And so the leader always tries to keep himself in the background to where nobody knows who he is.
Well, what are the proofs of conspiracy? That was also a book.
I was going to say.
But what are the proofs? In other words, what are the documentable evidentiary items that the John Birch Society has in its proof materials?
Well, the two primary ones are, as you say, Proofs of a Conspiracy by John Robison, and The History of the Jacobin Movement by Abbe Barruel. Now, Barruel was a Catholic priest, whereas John Robison was a very high Mason. And you had the two, what you see as opposites, exposing this Illuminati, this conspiracy. And the book is actually 4 volumes by Abbe Barwell. And he said that the reason that they document both of them, that the French Revolution was infiltrated and started actually by the Illuminati in France. And that the French authorities didn't understand that they were fighting a conspiracy. And Abbe Barwell says the reason they lost was because they didn't understand that one factor, that they had already been infiltrated by this conspiracy. And so that is part of the proof. Both books name names, they get into it, but along the road there are other writings by Engels and others that you can pluck out facts from their writings that prove that this thing was all a secret conspiracy from the onset. They even say that Frederick Engels says that the Communist International actually came out of the French secret societies, which were run by Illuminists. There were also documents that were sent by the Bavarian government to Austria, for instance, to Metternich, and who was Prime Minister of Austria, naming names of key international well-known names of individuals that they said were members of the Illuminati due to their investigations. They had discovered, due to a freak of God, that they discovered some papers of the Illuminati. The Illuminati had a messenger that was taking documents around to key leaders in the Illuminati. He got hit by lightning and got killed. The Bavarian authorities looked at the satchel he was carrying and says, "What's all this stuff about?" Started to see names in there and everything else about trying to kill people and take over governments and so on and so forth. They outlawed the Illuminati 5 times, giving the death penalty to anybody that recruited into the Illuminati. Our history books, by the way, said that the only one Bavarian edict was put out on the Illuminati, but actually there were 5. And as a result, you get documentation from the Bavarian government that's been there and that sort of thing. One of the problems, though, with investigating the early history, excuse me, of the Illuminati is that the Gestapo during World War II went in and confiscated the records of a lot of the organizations that they knew were run by the Illuminati. Now, no one seems to know whatever happened to all those papers. They went into the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, for instance, in Paris, and they took all those records, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the evidence has been destroyed in the early years of the Illuminati, but there's still enough there for us to understand it well enough to understand that they were the seed of the conspiracy today. Whether they still exist as the Illuminati, who knows? But we know just from circumstantial evidence that a conspiracy exists. I just say that to all those who are watching, flip through your television during the news hours and find out just exactly how all the commentators use the same identical words to describe political situations. They don't deviate at all. In fact, there was a video put out recently by somebody, I can't remember who it was, that actually showed hundreds of stations around the country that have used exactly the same verbiage for the same thing, the same evening, all over the country.
Well, your book, in the subtitle, addresses the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR.
That's correct.
How many members, high up members in the media, in banking, in politics, are CFR members? And tell us about the CFR, how they formed and how they operate.
Well, I'll answer your first question, part of your question first. There are just barely over 5,000 members, but it's not the numbers, it's how well they're organized and who they are. In the media, approximately 90% of all the news you get is either from a member of the CFR who is a person in front of the camera, a person who is the producer, the person who is the owner. And somewhere in there, in all the major, I mean, literally all the major news networks, there is members of the CFR in their hierarchy or in front of the camera. There are many times when I will watch even conservatives, commentators on Fox, whose guests are members of the CFR. They don't always say that, but they are. And some of them even have programs on Fox who are members of the CFR. They will sound like they're conservative. In economics, they talk about they will be conservative, but they never deviate from the internationalist line. They never deviate from it. They may be now turning against the UN as the one world government, but now they want to substitute a federation of states, a federation of nations instead, simply because everybody's waking up to the fact the UN's terrible. So they're going to have to put in another poison pill for us to swallow. So there, almost every, I don't know of an exception, but I'll use the word almost, every major foundation in the country is run by CFR members, and they finance other projects of the CFR. So you've got, even in the military, there are times I put a chart in my book that shows that in the military, the Department of Defense, the chiefs, Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Department of State, and the President were all members of the CFR at the same time. So you can see who are CFR members and everything, even running our State Department, our military, the whole 9 yards. And so it tells you why such publications have been put together called Freedom from War, which is an official United States State Department document saying that we've got to disarm the United States Armed Forces and turn it over to the UN. It tells you how they got that idea is because all these people were members of the CFR, but the people don't know that. They have no clue.
As the comedian I mentioned before, George Carlin said, "It's one big club and you're not a member."
That's about it.
How about banking? Go into banking.
Yeah, well, the banking is the same thing. About the same time, let me answer the other part of your first question because it evolves into a banking. At the Paris peace talks, the whole thing fell apart as far as the United States becoming part of the peace treaty, the armistice, and becoming a part of the League of Nations. We were the only country that rejected the League of Nations and becoming part of the whole scheme. And so as a result, a lot of the people that were at that meeting, they were called the Inquiry. It was a group of people put together by Woodrow Wilson and Edward Mendell House. And they put together this outfit called the Inquiry of about 150 people, intellectuals across a broad spectrum. And many of those, not many, but well, yeah, there were several of those people that formed the American delegation to the peace conference at Versailles, Paris, at the end of World War I. When they saw that America was going to reject the League of Nations, they linked up with the British counterparts at Paris and held a meeting and decided that they would form the Royal Institute for Foreign Affairs, and with a branch in the United States, with its sole purpose of bringing about a one world government. And so when they moved off to the United States, they didn't get much traction because they were named the same as the British were named, and that made Americans feel that that's a foreign idea. So they found a little outfit that was meeting called the Council on Foreign Relations, mostly a little discussion group, and they took it over and renamed themselves the Council on Foreign Relations. And its whole purpose was to negate the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and merged the United States into their, what they call a new world order. And by the way, that's what Karl Marx called it too. But at any rate, so they didn't have many members. They didn't have much influence at first, but then they started to infiltrate into major banking institutions and that sort of thing. They gathered those people into the process. And out of it, they formed the Federal Reserve and that sort of thing. And they literally took over. And by the way, the Federal Reserve is plank number 5 of the Communist Manifesto. Out of the 10 steps to communize a country, a central bank is step number 5. And so through their influence, they started the Federal Reserve and literally took over the banking industry of the United States. And they brought about, with certain Englishmen, the Great Depression. They actually manipulated credit and the money supply into a situation where it crashed the market. And when you start to look at the people who sold out before the crash, you get a pretty good idea of who were involved in the process.
Kind of just like today.
Exactly.
Going on.
Exactly. Just like those people that knew this pandemic was going to shut down the country, they ran out and sold all their stock. And now then they came back into the market when it was real low.
Yeah.
But at any rate, even Herbert Hoover was one of those that sold off all of his stock before the crash. Paul Warburg and others. In fact, Paul Warburg even sent out a signal in an article he wrote that it was not going to be long before. He didn't put it in these words, but that if you really read through and understand what he was saying, that the market was going to crash. So,
what blows people's minds is how Ronald Reagan, for example, when he was running for the nomination, he attacked these globalists openly in speeches. Mm-hmm. He gets elected, and ultimately all these globalists are in his cabinet, appointed by him. And then Donald Trump campaigns on basically, he's a different personality, but he campaigned on the same premises, and now he has appointed all globalists to his cabinet, whether it's Pompeo, who was at the Bilderberger conference, or Mnuchin from Goldman Sachs. It's always the same people from the same groups, and they're in the Republican administrations and they're in the Democratic. It's like, the Roach Motel. You get them in, but you can't get them out.
Well, you recall the book by, and here's another piece of evidence, Tragedy and Hope by Professor Quigley. He said the strategy is to have 2 parties, and they will look like they're different, but they really aren't, and they just revolve the door in and out of the White House, satisfying the desires of the voter, but really there's no difference between the two or their policies. He also gave a lot of evidence of the fact that this conspiracy existed. Now, he didn't call it a conspiracy, but he found out in the end that it was, because his book was never supposed to be public. It was designed to help recruit young kids at colleges into this scheme, to show them that if you do this, so you go down this path, you will become very prosperous, very famous. You'll become professors, you'll become this, you'll become that sort of thing. But once his book became public, because of members of the John Birch Society, they tried to put a stop to it. In fact, the publisher destroyed the plates. They used to use plates in those days to print with. They destroyed the plates and refused to republish it, even though there was a clamor for thousands of copies to be, hundreds of thousands of copies to be printed. So finally, some entrepreneurs in Taiwan took the book and pirated it and started to sell it. And then Quigley didn't get any royalties out of it at all. But he began to realize that, wait a minute, I guess the guys that I was working with for all these years really aren't my friends. And it was a big, rude eye-opener for him.
Let's address the elephant in the room here, since we're talking about bankers. I get this all the time people will say to me, "You're a Jew and you're a member of the John Birch Society." When they say bankers and when they say Federal Reserve, they mean Jews. How do you address that?
Well, it's hard for me to even address because it disgusts me so much. The just on the surface of it, okay, it is impossible that only a certain religion or race is at the pinnacle of this conspiracy, because what they do is recruit ambitious people, and ambitious people want to keep rising in whatever they do, their profession and their organizations and so on and so forth. They would not cooperate with any group that was exclusively one religion or one race. They wouldn't do it because, hey, I can only go so far. They're going to use me. Oh, I might have a nice soft chair at some university, but that's it. I'm at the end of the road. I don't want that. I want to be able to get better and better and more and more. I want to be the leader. In fact, you see that in the mafia all the time, right? I wanted to be the leader. What do they usually do when they want to be the leader? They shoot the leader. Sometimes the leader shoots him because he wants to get him first so he doesn't get shot himself. But at any rate, the whole idea, first of all, in the very beginning, the Illuminati would not allow women or Jews into their membership. And the reason they didn't was they felt that the Jews were too tied to their religion and could not be trusted to work for this anti-religious organization. It was just that simple. And besides, if later on they started to recruit Jews into the conspiracy, but not at the top. And but they recruited everybody, Englishmen, everybody, Germans, you name it. And by the way, one of the things they did do, and what led to a lot of this anti-Semitic stuff, is that a lot of the agents of the Illuminati, when they would go into a different country and work exclusively for the Illuminati, they adapted Jewish names, but they weren't Jews. It was done to throw people off track, and it got them to, okay, it's the Jews. Well, if you think it's the Jews, you've already lost, because it's not the target. It's not the Jews. It's over here, not over there. And there are people that exist that just love to hate, right? I don't know what's wrong with them. You see them in the streets. Some of them are good old boys, from down south or whatever, or some of them are leftists. They hate. They've got to have a target to hate. And so a target's given to them to hate, because it does a number of different things. It riles people up that they can get out and while they're making fools of themselves, they can get on television and convince all the audience that that's the typical individual that's behind all this stuff. So another thing that it does is that if you can convince people that it's a certain problem, like the Jewish are the problem, the Jews are the problem, then if you say the same thing and try and do the same thing that these people do, these anti-Semitics, then people think you're anti-Semitic because you're saying the same thing. And so it's a real neutralizer.
So if an anti-Semite says today is 9/2, September 2nd, and you say today is September 2nd, you're an anti-Semite.
Exactly. And it was a funny thing, by the way. When I joined the John Birch Society, all I read about the society was basically what I read in the newspapers, which told me they're anti-Semitic, they're communist, they're Nazi, they're all sorts of different things, whatever. And a little of that rubbed off on me, but I thought, well, I'll join them and see. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that the society was very adamant against any form of racism. That you could kick out of the John Birch Society for being a racist. Now, what's in your head and you never express, we don't know. But the history of the John Birch Society, we've got outside my door here, are huge numbers of files of people that we either have kicked out of the Birch Society or have red starred them to make sure they never become members of the John Birch Society, who are racist. We just we don't believe in it.
Well, we've got to wind down because we're running out of time. But I, for one, am a Jew who's very proud to be a member of the John Birch Society. And I am, for all the anti-Semites out there, I am a Zionist. I have a lot of connections to Israel. I believe that in the Bible, when God said he was giving Israel to Abraham and his progeny for time immemorial as an eternal covenant, I believe that. And if that makes me a Zionist in the eyes of the anti-Semites, then I am guilty of that. And I'm guilty of being a member of the John Birch Society. And I'm guilty of having a very high regard for you and everything you've accomplished and done in your life and the stands you've taken. And may God bless you and all of yours eternally.
Thank you.
And have a good day.
Thank you very much. Good to see you.
You too, man. Stop. Okay. Good job.
Thank you.
You got a lot in.
You know how many people logged on?
It's not live.
Oh, it's not. Oh, okay.
Yeah, well, depending on who I have on, I had Dr. Andrew Kaufman talking about COVID, but he's famous, so he got 40,000 views.
Wow.
I had Peter Schiff, who's pretty famous, on TV a lot. He got about 8,000 views. So I would say that we'll get about 1,000 views at least. It really depends. Also,
Sure.
Alex Newman generally takes a lot of my videos and he puts it on his stuff. And what happens is a lot of different people have their own little sites on various platforms and they post it. And so after a while, it builds up into thousands. I have a friend named Jeremiah doing this about roughly 2 years ago. He's a really good guy. He's a Christian, but when they had that shooting in Poway Jewish Center in Palm Springs, California, and they killed a woman in the congregation and they shot the rabbi, this fellow Jeremiah ran there with his guns and stood in front of that Jewish center for an entire week and slept in the rabbi's study to protect the Jews there. And he started doing these YouTube videos and he's getting now about 60, 70,000 views. And you can see him every day on YouTube. He does a nice job.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of people like that.
I had one, I've had several pretty good videos out there, but the one that got the most was on, I was talking about the early history of the conspiracy in the United States based on my book, To the Victor Go, the Myths and Monuments. And we were getting 30 to 35,000 views a day. And all of a sudden, when it hit 2,400,000, it went to zero.
Huh, that figures.
Yep.
Figures. Well, they've got an iron grip, unfortunately, and we try our best, and it doesn't always work out. You know, the Jews at the Warsaw Ghetto tried their best as well.
Yeah.
You got to fight the fight. You can never surrender. But you have to also understand the reality of the situation we're in. And, you know, for people in the older generation, we don't have that much more time on the earth. But for these kids, they've been let down by their parents and by the older generation.
Yeah, you know, there's an organization in Poland called Go Against the Tide. And they're very pro-Israel. And they've invited me over there 3 times. I've been there twice. This year I did not go because of the pandemic. I didn't know if I could get into Poland, and I sure couldn't come back to the United States at that time.
Right.
But they have annual conferences, and I did go on Zoom with them, though, trying to help them understand how to get better organized, because they're not very well organized. Well, they are well organized, but not well enough, let's put it that way. And they basically have said that most of the conservative leaders in Poland are really ex-Soviet agents.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
Ironically, during the war, the Poles were known as virulent anti-Semites back in those days. So life has a lot of turns to it, a lot of crazy curves and turns.
Well, they probably shot all the anti-Semites.
Yeah,
You know,
true. That's true.
in fact, the guy that heads it up, Pavel Hochecki, he's a Christian minister. His father was a communist, and he was raised a communist. And then something clicked in his head that he realized this isn't right. And then finally started to organize people into an anti-communist organization. A lot of young people in it.
One last question that I forgot to ask you during the interview. A friend of mine asked this question. He said, why did the globalists want to get rid of Nixon by impeachment if he was really doing their bidding?
Well, I think it's like, let's go back to the mafia again. Just because one of your guys is doing a good job, if he has ambitions that go beyond what involves your own personal safety or leadership, what do? And I think they got rid of Nixon because he had 2 things. He had become a liability, for one thing. People were beginning to see through Nixon, and you never know what's going to happen where things start to snowball. For instance, just because Nixon's one of the boys doesn't mean that everybody in the media understands that and lays off. They started to attack him in the media to where he became a liability. So that was one thing. And then who knows what else. He probably started to think he was a bigger guy than what he was, that he got where he was all on his own. If you remember correctly, he used to actually live in a New York apartment on the same floor with Nelson Rockefeller.
Yep, and worked for his law firm.
That's right. And so he was mainly an underling. And when an underling starts to think he's bigger than everybody else, sometimes they just got to get rid of him.
I gotcha. All right. Well, I got to get running to the store.
Okay. Good talking to you.
And let's stay in touch.
Okay. Will do.
All right, man. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.